Thanks very much, Alan, for agreeing to appear with me. And thanks to Andrew and the Bristol Festival of Ideas for the invite, which I'm grateful. So my book is a book about how the internet, mobile phones and all of that has changed culture very broadly. And the argument of the book is that before we had the internet, mobile phones and all of these things, there was an idea called cybernetics. And if we reach back in time to understand cybernetics and what it wanted us to become, then we'll have a better idea of, to a certain extent, what we have become in a world in which we spend a lot of time pressing buttons and responding to feedback rapidly and very responsively on our Blackberries, on the internet, on our mobile phones, etc. So cybernetics, very simply, is the idea which was invented by an American mathematician called Norbert Wiener in the early 1940s. It was invented as part of the war effort, and it was invented in order to understand how an anti-aircraft gun could more responsibly target an enemy airplane in the sky, how it could zigzag around and respond to new information in order to shoot German bombers out of the sky during the Battle of Britain. And this idea suggested, or reinterpreted, most of life as a giant electronic or a giant information loop in which everyone and everything was sending out messages and responding to feedback very quickly. More than that, the idea of cybernetics as it was developed by Norbert Wiener suggested that in this new age of electronic machines that we were moving into, then if in practice we were all engaged on this continuous electronic information loop, if we were constantly sending out messages, if we were responding very rapidly to feedback, then we'd all be better off because society would move in a more harmonious way because we'd be in constant touch with everyone and everything. Well, 60 or 70 years later, it turns out that we all do live on this giant electronic information loop with our electronic gizmos, with our mobile phones, with Twitter, with the internet. We're constantly sending out messages. We're rapidly responding to feedback that comes in. And the idea of my book is that we can use this idea of cybernetics. It's a very simple thing that we're doing. Posting out messages, responding to feedback to understand how that's changed us. How that's changed the kind of people that we are, how you want to process information, the kind of culture that we want to consume, the way that our organizations work, and even how we go to war. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is tell you a story, one true story, and within that, 3 stories which may or may not be true. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether they are and how far they can be true, so you can make up your own mind. Now the true story is that in the summer of 2006, the head of research at AOL in America, a man called Dr. Abdur Chaudhuri, had an idea which was quite brilliant enough to get him the immediate sack. And the idea was that given how many millions of people were rolling up to AOL search engine to type in their innermost thoughts, impulses, and desires, then why not post that information and see what could be done with it. Now, Chaudhuri's idea was noble and it was well informed, and it was informed by the fact that data, good data, is very expensive to come by, especially among the academic researchers who are often in a position to make the most interesting use of it. His idea was that if you present academic researchers with this fresh and very immediate sense of what people are typing into search engines, then maybe it might help them, and it might lead to some interesting new ideas. Naturally, there were going to be safeguards. First safeguard was that all of the people using AOL search engine wouldn't be identified as people. They would be identified as anonymous numerical usernames. And secondly, this information was going to be posted on a very obscure academic website so that no one would chance upon it. Which seems naive in retrospect, because as we know, attempts by big institutions to post information in low-key and sensitive ways on obscure websites don't tend to work, because there's a kind of sudden feeding frenzy on the internet, in the darker corners of the internet, populated by geeks and hackers. And in this case, when a passing internet user came upon this information, it was discovered to contain 23 million different search keywords for 650,000 AOL search users from earlier that year. Now, among the kind of subterranean geeks and hackers who quickly got hold of this information, it was as if Christmas had come early and they began pasting it up all around the internet. AOL tried to remove it within a couple of days, but it was already too late. What made this information so interesting for people was that before this, you could have a look at internet search keywords what people were typing in, but you couldn't trace those search keywords back to individual people, even if you didn't know their name. They were just kind of formless mass of internet search keywords. Now, with these anonymous numerical usernames, you could trace thoughts back to individuals, and over a period of time, perhaps get an insight into their train of thought as it developed. And it wasn't very long before some people were able to trace anonymous numerical usernames back into real people. So within about a week, a reporter from the New York Times showed up on the doorstep of a 62-year-old widow in Georgia called Thelma Arnold, who, over the course of 3 months earlier that year, the period in which this information was released, had typed in lots of different things. She typed in a search for 60 single men. She typed in a search for a dog that urinates on a carpet. And very slowly, as she typed in various relative names, she gave herself away. This New York Times reporter showed up on her doorstep, and she was shocked. And she said, you know, I had no idea that someone was staring over my shoulder when I was typing these things in. Now, no one had really been staring over Thelma Arnold's shoulder, and in the kind of brouhaha over privacy which followed, during which Pearl Dr. Chowdhury was very loudly fired, it was easy to forget that millions of people queued up to type in all their innermost thoughts and impulses and half-baked intentions into this gigantic database, which was able, as a consequence, to compile a pretty comprehensive register of all of these things. And that's not only the only place where the information went, because it turns out that in 2002, AOL had arrived at an agreement with Google, whereby Google would service all of its search engine queries. So all of this information not only went to banks of servers controlled by AOL, it also went to banks of servers somewhere in Ohio controlled by Google. So what I'm going to do is to give you an example of one kind of electronic information loop and think and speculate as to what we can learn from this and how it might be changing us, etc. I'm going to run through 3 tightly edited series of searches for different people and see if we can reconstruct something of their lives using what they typed into that search engine. So the first one that I want to talk about is a young woman who at the beginning of the search period, at the beginning of 2006, appears to be at the early stages of a pregnancy. So she appears to be pregnant. And then clearly it becomes apparent that her boyfriend may not be so keen on the pregnancy. If I was to see a video, that's an American.